Hi, Sean from Dodeca Dungeon here. Today I'm going to be talking about how to make combat more interesting, particularly as a dungeon master. Now, being such a large part of Dungeons and Dragons, we use combat a lot, and often using the same sort of basic combat rules and grids can make it kind of seem monotonous and boring. To prevent that, I'm going to give a few tips and suggestions on how to try to make it more interesting. Now, one thing to do is simply just change up the terrain a little bit. Even just adding like a river through your battle makes things interesting. If it's a cave, you could have stalactites fall from the ceiling every once in a while. You could have like a lava river flowing through the area. You could have mist that obscures the player's sight, as well as making their movement slower. So all these sort of things can help spice up combat, and if your players are smart enough, a lot of these would give an opportunity to be taken advantage of. For example, it might be some kind of narrow bridge that the players are crossing, and maybe they decide to take use of the push action, which we don't see as often. One of the best experiences I had as a dungeon master with encounters is this one particular fight where they're in the Coliseum, and there's these pillars all around the edges of the Coliseum, and it was just a pit below. So each of the players started on a pillar, and in the center was this wyvern. And they really made use of the space by pushing enemies. One player actually used Crown of Madness on an enemy, causing it to grapple another enemy, and then both villains basically jumped off of the ledge, which I think was really smart. Also, one of the players jumped onto the wyvern and rolled a nat 20 on its animal handling check, so the wyvern joined its side, and they helped battle the rest of the gladiators, which I thought was really creative. And just by giving the players that opportunity and having them take advantage of it in ways you would never dream of is really rewarding as a dungeon master. Also, allowing the players to make use of cover even is something that you like. I don't remember the last time I've seen cover used, and I think it's a really interesting mechanic, especially if you have ranged players, to bring cover into it, or make experiment with flanking a little bit, or just different things to make the strategy and positioning of combat a little bit more important. Also, there are spells in the game that do this trick for you. For example, the spell Wrath of Nature from Xanathar's Guide, 5th level spell that basically creates this natural area where the spirits of nature fight by your side. It causes these grasses to sprout out that makes the terrain difficult for your enemies. There's these trees that have whipping branches that actually slash at enemies each turn. The roots and vines restrain enemies. It's just all these stuff going on at once that makes combat really interesting, especially for your villain, and makes I feel like there's a lot going on. This is one of the great things about layer actions, is it also adds this kind of feeling that the area around them is alive and fighting with them. And sometimes if you have this, you don't even need minions or anything. And just kind of that sense of the area around you is out to get you is, I think, really captivating and kind of unique that group players probably don't see as often. Just another quick example, Druid Grove is a 6th level spell that creates the fog I was talking about earlier, simulates the Entangle spell, and summons awakened trees and an additional spell effect. So just all these things going at once is really, I think, has to make the players keep on toes. And I think as a dungeon master, maybe some of you feel a little bit overwhelmed if you're building a lot of enemies, but particularly for like more boss fights where you just have one enemy, it might be fun to give yourself other stuff to do. I personally find it pretty fun to have that chance, because unlike the players who get a lot of action and action economy, you kind of have to spice that up as the dungeon master in order to equalize that. Another simple trick is making your own monsters or changing the monster stats, things that are more interactive and more intuitive. And I'll probably go over this more in depth in another video. But for example, keeping druids and vines in mind, I imagine a cool like poison ivy type villain that maybe can like sprout up vines from the ground and have them attack the players, or maybe even poison a player to make that player be a host that each turn they make an action. It summons a vine for the poison ivy villain. So like it just kind of gets your gears going, right? Just having this kind of character in mind and turning that character into a boss, I think really sparks some neat ideas. And that's where I draw a lot of my inspiration for bosses, such as even moves from Super Smash Brothers, like just like Link's spin attack or whatnot. I think really inspires some unique boss ideas that I think as you'll start to connect these characters to what kind of actions they make in D&D, especially if you kind of understand the game and how to take advantage of those mechanics, I think can get really interesting. The best editions for combat is 4th edition. This introduced powers, which some were just instant, others were on a recharge, and basically this gave the players a lot of options in combat. Like, it makes me kind of think about the Hunter Ranger, where they can do things like create a volley of attacks or like hack through a ton of enemies, and they all have all these different options for different scenarios. And I think giving the players some of these abilities from 4th edition as rewards or training or something can make them want to use these abilities opposed to their normal attacks. So it's giving the players the tools to make combat more interesting themselves, because sometimes there's only so much you can do as a DM to change up the environment. And again, sometimes it's not up to you. I mean, the players really do have to take that initiative. And if you're giving them these abilities and these terrain options and they're really not taking to it, if they're doing this and not being receptive, it's not your fault. It's okay. You can either talk to them about how maybe you want a little bit more work from them, or maybe find a new group that does. Probably the best variety that's not in 4th edition is spells. Simply giving your players spell scrolls that they don't have, maybe that aren't as common, like Crown of Madness or something that is not initially powerful, but if used in the right way, like I described earlier, can have some really interesting combat effects. So by giving the players these spell scrolls that maybe even are higher level, it can really inspire some interesting combat strategies on the side of the player. And it really pays off when the players use your terrain and items and things like that in ways you would never dream of, and really bringing it above and beyond. Not only spell scrolls, but another thing is magic items, especially ones that aren't just base damage, but have some sort of utility effect that, if used in the right scenario, once again, you can get some really interesting stuff going in combat. Even out of combat, like one time I gave my players the eyes of the mole, which basically reduce your normal sight to 5 feet, but give you tremor sense up to 30 feet. And they were in this trap room, and it was one of those like Xanathar's Guide traps that has different things going on at different initiatives, and he was able to sense, using tremor sense, where the gears were in order to disable this trap, which I think was really creative and used these glasses in a way that I never thought would be used. So I know that's an out-of-combat example, but giving your players these different items that may not normally be seen as something you give them for combat, or that certain scenario can end up being something for that, just because your players are able to find use for it that you would never have otherwise found use for it. So, and that can definitely be really rewarding. Even items that would actually normally be seen in combat. The Javelin of Lightning is one of my favorite examples, because it's not just something that deals extra damage. You throw it and it deals damage in a line, so it has more like a spell effect, but it gives melee fighters that different option, while also making them feel really cool. Now I'm just going to read off some of the 4E abilities I either took inspiration from or converted. So, for example, one's Covering Attack, which it just turns your normal attack into a barrage that distracts the enemy enough to allow your companion to sneak out without provoking opportunity attacks. So just a simple ability, but helps it, it can be useful in the right scenario. Oh, this one I think I made up. Blam Blam. Name needs work. You can increase your normal attacks by 1 by imposing disadvantage on 2 of those attacks. Those recharge abilities, so like once per day might be Armor Piercing Strike, where on a hit, if the enemy has armor natural worn, you roll a d4 and it reduces their AC by that much. But it's in specific scenarios, so if your players are using this, you can reduce this, just reducing it by 1 or 2, or you can always just use more enemies that don't have armor. So this one's pretty easy to control. Another simple one is Tide of Iron, which after you hit an enemy, you can push them for free. Now, the push action is often really underrated, so by attaching that to an attack allows it to really shine and to make combat a lot more interesting. Disarming Attack, which just instead of dealing damage, you can make an attack roll against their weapon, which you disarm and knock like 10 feet away. So this way, if, again, it's based off of the enemy, if it has a physical weapon they're holding, but this can make things really interesting by getting rid of one of their weapons, and maybe if it's a magical one, a player can hold it up and wield it for themselves. Another one is Grappler, which each turn you maintain the grapple, you can pin down the enemy, dealing 1d8 bludgeoning damage to the grapple target. So this makes grappling a little bit stronger. Maybe too much. Or, ridiculously named once again, Pick on Someone Your Own Size. When an attacking creature at least 2 sizes larger than you, you deal an additional 1d4 damage on hit. Another thing you can do is make use of the Dungeon Master's Guide's alternate attack options. One of my favorite is the Cleave variant, where if you kill a creature and you have excess damage, that damage rolls over to a creature within 5 feet of it. So this way you can have massive hordes of enemies with super low health that you can just rack through, and it feels really good as a player to do this, as well as a DM, because you get to throw tons of enemies at them. And again, you wouldn't use this that often, but when you would, it would make the players really happy, and I think it would be really fun for you. Even by giving some of your players some of the Battle Master abilities, maybe not even adding the superiority die, just giving the option, for example, to make the Riptossi attack just as a reaction, bam, make a strike backward at them, or give out one of your attacks to help them have an ally make an attack, just different things like that. I think that the Battle Master is designed really well, and it gives a lot of options in combat, which if you give to other players, makes them have a lot of options and make it feel really good. And I know mixing classes might be ill-advised because that class would be designed for that specific ability, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it's going to help more than it hurts. And also, these are just suggestions. Just take the ones or none that you feel like. They also have rules for climbing onto a bigger creature, where you make a athletics or acrobatics check to see if you can jump on them, and which would give a smaller creature advantage on attacking them while you're on that bigger creature, which I think is really cool visually and also mechanically. Like I talked about earlier, there's the disarm option where you make a make your attack basically instead make a check, athletics or acrobatics against acrobatics, to see if you can disarm them, which I think is really interesting, and I think is a nice change from a normal punch or slash. There's options to move through an enemy player's space by, for example, there's a tumble option where you can roll through their space where you make a acrobatics check against an acrobatics check, and if you win, you're able to go through that space, which that's one of my best favorite ones. Like, I don't think it adds to combat and just kind of makes things like, I don't even know why you want to do that. They also have different options, like some for injuries, where after they are knocked to 0 hit points and aren't killed outright, take a critical hit, or maybe fail that save by a large amount, they might get a lingering injury. Now, this can be interesting because it adds a lot of role-playing. For example, they might have a scar that, you know, gives disadvantage on all other charisma checks, but advantage on intimidation, or some sort of limp that probably doesn't have much of a benefit, but if you play it right, you can, you know, be super gritty as a player, which if you're into that campaign, like a more kind of survival gritty realism campaign, I think that can be a really good option. But in terms of making combat fun, sometimes as a player you don't want your PC to lose a body part, so be careful with this one, folks. I only gave one example about how magic items could be incorporated in interesting ways, but I think I'll save more of that for another video, because making magic items is a big topic and it's a little daunting, so I think I'll cover that in its own video. But I think if you do it right, it can be really rewarding, and honestly, I think that's one of the most fun parts of the game, especially like creating enemies, taking inspiration from other sources and bringing that into the game. Or even, I'm sure there's been moments where it's like, why isn't that in the game? And now you can put it in the game. So that's one of the things that I love so much about Dungeons & Dragons, is because you aren't restricted to the rules, and you get to do stuff like this, like make combat wacky, and also create your own items and worlds. And though this can be daunting for newer DMs, and you might want to stick to normal combat, I think it can bring some real advantages both for you and the players by incorporating this eventually into your games. Also, I think on one of Matt Coville's videos, he talked about this idea of a monster wrangler, which means that one of the players controls some of the enemies, which kind of makes things easier for the dungeon master and it creates trust between you and your players, because often, this isn't true for everyone, but often the player will try to repay that trust by making the enemy seem as vicious and strategic as possible, which I think could work for some parties better than the others, but I think that's what we'll try now. Also, another thing from 4th edition is the minion rule, which basically you can have these stronger monsters, or a lot of them, but they only have 1 hit point, which means that they can be defeated really easily, and there's a few rules that keep them on the battlefield a little bit longer, like if they make their save, they just don't take any damage, or things like that make it so that while they are on the battlefield, they have more of a presence. So just experimenting around with that, I think, can be really rewarding. There is honestly a lot of things you can do as a dungeon master to make combat more interesting. So the world is your oyster. You're still here? I don't have any more tips for you, I'm sorry. No. I said go. Shoo. You have better things to do. You're watching a YouTube channel with less subscribers than your shoe size. Okay. Just for the fans. Just for the fans. This is top secret. It would be a little hint for next video. All right? You ready? Now close your eyes.